as many different types of objects as there are in 3D Studio, and there's tons. At some point you're going to want to change those objects up a little bit or modify them, and there are so many different ways to modify something in 3D Studio Max. There's a ridiculous number. Well, the first way is that you can come over here to the Modify panel so we can get a better look at it. I'm going to move it, up towards us here. And I'm going to apply what's called a modifier. So here in the Modify panel, not only can you change these, but you can apply new modifiers on top of this thing. And this is where 3D Studio just gets ridiculous with the amount of stuff that you can do. If I take this thing, I have a thing called Modifier List. I open that up, and this list is so big that it even goes way off your screen. It goes all the way to the bottom of my screen. And so the amount of modifications that you can make to an object that exists are just, it's insane. And if you look at the sheer amount of these things, it's easy to get overwhelmed. There's so many. But the great thing about 3D Studio is it uses this thing called a stack, which means you can edit these things non-destructively. So you come in here, and let's say some of these are more kind of utilitarian and more about editing the mesh, and some won't make a lot of sense right now. We'll get to a bunch of these in a little bit, but a lot of these are just a blast to kind of play with. So you come down here and you have one called taper. And taper, now when I add a taper to the spiral stair, you see that there's my initial object, my spiral stair, that's as it was created. And then you have taper on top of that. This is called the stack. So if I taper this thing by some amount, let's taper it. I'm going to taper the very tippy top and make it a real pointy spiral stair. I've tapered it by some amount. The taper itself has all of these different parameters, so I can make it curved taper, curved in one way or the other. I can also change the axis of the taper, so primary and affect which axes, so I can get all kinds of different results with it. And just by clicking the buttons, I get a live preview of what's going to happen. This is where 3D Studio gets, again, to be a blast and extremely powerful, actually, because you can make changes to something that you do, and whoa, that's not right at all. You just come in and change it back, or you can choose to limit it to a certain size, like I'm only tapering up till here, and so you just play around with these, and it'll never, you just feel very comfortable knowing that it won't actually ever really truly destroy anything, because you say, oh yeah, I don't like that, just turn back off limit, and then go back to what you'd had before. And the really powerful thing about this modifier stack is that even though I've tapered this staircase, you say, well, I like what I've tapered it to here, but I need more stairs, or they're too thick here. I can always go back to the original parameters of the spiral staircase and change them here. So if I change a number of stairs, I can change it right there, and the height, how high it goes, or the depth of the thickness of the stairs right here, I make them thinner. I can always go back, and my taper is still active. And you can see you can make these changes, and it even makes the changes and with the taper applied to it. So this is an incredibly intuitive and powerful way to work. Now modifiers, this is called a modifier stack after all, can be, you might venture a guess, they can be stacked. So if I take some other object here, already got a couple of modifiers on it, and if it's already got some on it, I can go in and add another one. So let's add a bend to it. I'm going to add a bend modifier and choose an amount to bend that thing. So I can bend that, make the little bag run around, or whatever I want to do. So bend. And modifiers, each individual modifier, you see, has a light bulb next to it and has a plus sign next to it. The plus sign, if I click on it, expand that, it has a couple of what we'd call sub-objects. It has a thing called a gizmo, and that just means, and yes, that's 3D Studio's word for it. Even the transform, rotate, and scale things, these are called gizmos, but I more often call them manipulators. Doesn't sound quite so goofy. But anyway, no, it's really, that's 3D Studio's terminology for it. It's gizmo. And a center. The gizmo is the sort of kind of I guess it's a container, and that container kind of gives you a preview or a sense of what this operation is going to do. So this kind of like takes the bounding box of this object, and within that it bends it according to this shape. So you get a preview of what it's kind of going to look like or supposed to look like. But it also has this other one, center. And when you take the center, you can expand bend or any other modifier, and very often have a center or an axis or something like that. If you take the center of it, you can transform the center around in the gizmo, and you can affect where the bend is beginning from. So if the bend begins at the top, that's different than if the bend begins at the bottom, and then I can change the bend again. Now he's bending from the bottom and sort of doing a little dance around. And if I take the gizmo and then, let's say, rotate the gizmo around, now I can get him to bend forwards or backwards, do back bends, forward bends, and change the angle again. So I back and forward now. So not only can you add these modifiers and stack these modifiers, but you can change the parameters of the modifiers, but you can also then change the sub-objects, or sort of the centers and how they're being applied to the thing. And so, the sheer amount of stuff that you can do with these things is pretty incredible. And so now I've bent him, so I can go in and do something else. I can come in and do I could do a taper on him as well, and taper it in just a little bit and make this little, butt fatter or something like that. And change the curve of it. So you can use modifiers to model and make changes to your geometry. And you can see they just get stacked up. So there's one thing on top of another thing on top of another thing. And now those things can be disabled or enabled at any time. There's this light bulb next to it that allows me to show or hide the effects of any one of these modifiers. So if I turn the light bulb off on taper, let's make that a little bit more extreme so we can see it. Turn the light bulb off, and it will turn off the taper. Turn off the bend, keeps the taper, anything above it, but just turns off the bend. So I get to layer these things up. If I turn back on noise, which is something that I had deactivated, a little noise modifier. Now, again, the really cool part about this, I can go back through any level of this stack and make changes to the noise, and change that around if I want to the bend, and then everything on top of it will update accordingly. And some of these things are just a blast. There's no way I'm going to go through every single one of these, look through the documentation, but most importantly, just look through the modifier list here and look in, see what else. Oh, melt, that seems like a blast. So let's pick melt and just, you see the parameters here. Oh yeah, look at that. Melt, give it an amount, so I can melt the bag there. For some reason it's kind of going into the ground, so I can melt the bag, and I can give it different melt properties. Does it melt like glass? Does it melt like jelly? Does it melt like plastic? What's the way in which this thing would melt? Probably plastic. I don't know if that's gonna do it better or not. But then melt has its own sub-objects that you can change around, and you can change the center around which it melts, and the axis along which it's melting. And it looks like what I did here was to melt it before I tapered it. So the stack is something that if I click on something, the modifier is going to go in immediately above whatever I had picked. So if I take melt and now say, well, I didn't really want it there, I can rearrange it. I can put the melt after the taper just by clicking it, dragging it, and dropping it. Now the melt is going to occur after the taper, so that's giving me a little bit more like what I would expect from the melt. So it's going to the stack can be rearranged at any time, or if I wanted to bend it after I melted it, I just take the bend and put it up there, bend it after the melt occurs. So I can also even go in and take any one of these things, click this, and go in and melt that. I can melt everything in here if I really want to. So melt, right? Come back and even melt my staircase. Melt. Melt that staircase. So if you say, well, that was stupid, I melt the staircase, you can always get rid of them. So again, no change that you're making with modifiers is ever destructive until you do a thing called collapse the stack, which we'll look at in a sec. But if I take melt and say, well, that was stupid, I can always just deactivate it, or I can just take it and delete it entirely. This little button here is delete the modifier, and then I can get back to what I had. So same thing with this. If well, that was dumb too. Why did I do that? I can pick that thing and the modifier is still there, just delete it, and it's back to where it was. There's a few other buttons underneath the stack, and so you have this one here. This is show end result. What that means is kind of like what I've been talking about. If I come down here to bend and I change how I've done the bend, it's showing me not only the everything underneath bend, but also whatever's on top of bend, so taper and melt as well. If I turn that off, it's just going to show me how I'm bending it. So that can be a useful way to say, well, I bent it this much, and now what happens when I taper it, and now what happens when I melt it. So you can choose to either show it or not show it, depending on sometimes it can be hard to visualize what your bend is doing while you have all that other junk on top of it. And then you have this other one here, which you can configure modifier sets and use these sets. So it's a little bit hard. It kind of goes off screen there. If I move my 3D Studio over a little bit, you'll be able to see it. So see the menu here. You can configure them. You can show buttons. That will just give you a list of buttons here that you can show. So if you have frequently used modifiers, you can have you can make your own little sets here. You can use their sets, so mesh editing, and you can have any number of buttons there that you want. Just like I said, frequently used buttons that you're using for a certain application, like patch or spline editing, mesh editing, animating when you're doing your UVs or your mapping coordinates. So you can come in here and you can also configure modifier sets. So increase the number of buttons, because even though there's an empty spot here, you have to give it an explicit number, so 22 buttons. And you can come in here and you can say, well, let's add melt to that. And so we'll take that, drag it, drop it there, and we'll say my stack, modifier stack or whatever. Hit save and OK, and then it'll automatically switch to that one, and it'll show up in here right there as a saved modifier set that you can come back to all the time for, again, certain tasks that you might do over and over.